July 1917. The Western Front. General John J. Pershing stood in a muddy trench watching German ground attack aircraft strafe American positions. The pilots flew low and confident because they knew something that terrified the soldiers below. Their aircraft wore armor plating that laughed at .30 caliber machine gun fire. Pershing sent an urgent cable to Washington. America needed a new weapon, something with at least half an inch of caliber and a muzzle velocity exceeding 2,700 feet per second. Something that could punch through steel. The man who answered that call was John Moses Browning, the greatest firearms designer who ever lived. He took his proven M19 17.30 caliber water-cooled machine gun and simply scaled everything up. Bigger barrel, bigger bolt, and most importantly, a much bigger cartridge. That new round became the .50 BM, the Browning machine gun, also known as 12.7 by 99 millimeters, basically a scaled-up .3006 with inspiration from captured German anti-tank rifle ammunition. They didn't know it at the time, but they had just created one of the most effective cartridges in military history, a round so powerful and versatile that it's still standard issue over a century later. The first prototype was tested on October 15, 1918. Full trials occurred exactly 1 week after the armistice ended World War I, and then for nearly 2 decades the gun looked like a complete failure. The original M1921 water-cooled version weighed a cumbersome 121 pounds and could only feed ammunition from the left side, which made it useless for most vehicle and aircraft applications. Tankers couldn't use it. Aircraft designers couldn't mount it properly. Infantry certainly couldn't carry it. The air-cooled variant was even worse. It overheated so badly that barrels fractured after only 75 rounds of sustained fire. The muzzle velocity fell short of specifications. The rate of fire seemed inadequate, and the whole package was simply too heavy. A complete ground setup, gun, tripod, and mounting hardware weighed between 130 and 130 pounds before you even counted ammunition. Each .50 BMG cartridge weighed about 4 ounces, so a belt of 100 rounds added another 25 pounds. Smaller aircraft couldn't carry the weight effectively. Early vehicle turrets couldn't accommodate the left side-only ammunition feed. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, the M2 seemed destined for obsolescence, with its only real application being anti-aircraft coastal defense. John Browning passed away in 1926, never seeing his creation reach its full potential. But development continued. The breakthrough came between 1927 and 1932, when engineers at Colt developed a universal receiver, allowing ammunition feed from either side. More importantly, they created the heavy barrel variant, the M2HB, that finally addressed the catastrophic overheating problem. By 1933, the M2 heavy barrel that emerged weighed 84 pounds, fired at 450 to 575 rounds per minute, and achieved an effective range exceeding 2,000 yards. The .50 BMG cartridge delivered between 10 and 15,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy, roughly 4 times the power of a .3006 rifle round. To put that in perspective, the submachine guns and pistols of that era delivered maybe 3 to 500 foot-pounds. The .50 BMG was putting out 20 to 30 times more energy, but it could penetrate nearly an inch of hardened steel armor at 100 yards. It could disable light vehicles with a single shot. It could turn concrete walls into rubble. Then World War II began, and the M2 finally got its chance to prove what it could do. More importantly, the men who operated it got their chance to discover just how terrible that job would be. American heavy bombers were built around a specific tactical philosophy: fly so high that anti-aircraft guns couldn't reach you effectively, and mount enough defensive firepower to handle any fighters that tried to intercept. The problem was that enemy fighters could absolutely reach those altitudes, and they came in relentless, coordinated waves. The B-17 Flying Fortress carried 13 M2 machine guns spread across 9 different positions. The B-24 Liberator carried 10. Out of a standard 10-man bomber crew, the majority were gunners. Their job was to fight off attacking fighters while being shot at themselves, at altitudes where simply breathing was difficult, and temperatures could kill you as surely as bullets. The aircraft version of the M2, designated an M2, short for Army-Navy Model 2, was quite different from the ground gun. It weighed only 61 pounds compared to 84 for the ground version, with a shorter 36-inch barrel. But the most important difference was rate of fire. Aircraft M2S fired at 750 to 850 rounds per minute, with some specially tuned models pushing 1,200 rounds per minute, nearly double the ground gun's rate. The reason was simple. When a German Bf-109 or FW-190 fighter is screaming past you at several hundred miles per hour, you have maybe 2 or 3 seconds to hit it before it's gone. You need as many rounds in the air as possible during that tiny window dot, and because the aircraft was moving through freezing air at high speed, the slipstream did the cooling work that heavy ground barrels needed extra mass to handle. German pilots quickly figured out that to bring down a bomber, especially one that had fallen out of formation, they first had to eliminate the gunners defending it. The waist gunner positions, those open windows on either side of the fuselage, took roughly 20% of all hits on heavy bombers. The men standing there with handheld M2S paid a terrible price, approximately 20% killed and another 20% wounded, the highest casualty rate of any crew position. Then there was the ball turret. If you want to understand just how bad life could get for a .50 caliber gunner, this is the perfect example. The Sperry ball turret hung beneath the B-17's belly like a glass tumor, a plexiglass sphere just 44 inches across. The gunner had to curl into a fetal position to fit inside with his twin M2S, knees drawn up to his chest, completely isolated from the rest of the crew. Only men 5'4" or shorter could physically squeeze inside. Taller men were automatically disqualified, which was probably a mercy. The turret itself was actually statistically harder to hit than other positions because of its small size and location tucked up against the fuselage. That wasn't what made it terrifying. The problem was getting out. Parachutes couldn't be worn in that cramped space. There simply wasn't room. So if the bomber was going down and you needed to bail out, you had to follow this procedure. Rotate the turret to align the hatch with the fuselage opening, unbuckle from your position, climb up through the hatch into the aircraft, locate your parachute where it was stored, strap it on properly, and then jump. If the turret's electric motor was knocked out by enemy fire, you could hand crank it using a manual system. But if the mechanism jammed or if the fuselage was too damaged and the hatch wouldn't align properly, you were trapped, and if the bomber had to make an emergency belly landing with you still inside, you would be crushed between the runway and the aircraft's weight. There are documented cases of pilots having to bring their damaged aircraft down, knowing their ball turret gunner was stuck below, unable to escape. The kind of decision no 22-year-old aircraft commander should ever have to make landing the plane to save 8 men while killing the 9th. The tail gunner had his own version of hell, crammed into a tiny compartment at the very back of the aircraft with twin 50s, completely alone and isolated from the rest of the crew during combat. When German fighters attacked from behind, which they frequently did, you were the only thing between them and the bomber's vulnerable empennage, and all of these gunners had to deal with the cold on top of everything else. At 25,000 to 35,000 feet in completely unpressurized aircraft with open gun positions, temperatures routinely dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes minus 60 during winter missions over Germany. Wind blast through the waist gun windows caused over half of all frostbite cases by 1944, if a gun jammed, which happened frequently in those temperatures, and you pulled off your heavy gloves to clear the malfunction. Your bare skin would freeze to the metal almost instantly. Some men lost fingers this way. During 1943 and 1944, more aircrew were lost to cold-related injuries than to direct enemy action. One ball turret gunner later said, "By the time you reached the target, you were so cold and miserable that you didn't particularly care anymore whether you made it back or not. You just wanted it to be over." The overall casualty figures for the 8th Air Force, the primary American bomber force operating over Nazi Germany, show just how bad it was. Of combat crewmen flying missions, over 12% were killed outright. Total casualty rates exceeded those of the Marine Corps, Army, and Navy combined. In 1942 and 1943, you had to complete 25 missions to finish your tour and rotate home, but only about 1/3 of crews made it that far. The odds were literally against you, and remember, the majority of every bomber crew were gunners, men standing behind M2 Browning machine guns, fighting for their lives at altitudes where the air was too thin to breathe without oxygen, in temperatures cold enough to kill, against enemy fighters specifically trained to kill them first. But the skies weren't the only place where .50 caliber gunners were paying with their lives. By 1945, roughly 2 million M2 machine guns had been produced and shipped to every theater of the war. Every American Jeep seemed to have one mounted. Every tank, every half-track. The weapon was everywhere. German soldiers facing that kind of firepower had to completely change how they fought. The .50 BMG existed in a different class entirely from the rifle-caliber machine guns that most armies used. If you were defending a position from inside a building, the concrete or brick walls that would stop rifle rounds wouldn't help you anymore. The .50 would either punch straight through masonry or a sustained burst would cause structural collapse. Even medium tanks like the German Panzer IV could have their vision optics shot out, their tracks destroyed, or take penetrating hits through thinner side and rear armor. Japanese tanks in the Pacific, which were much more lightly armored, were routinely knocked out by .50 caliber fire alone. There's a persistent myth that the 50 BMG was banned by the Geneva Conventions because of what it does to the human body. That's not true. No such ban exists. But the effect on human bodies certainly wasn't exaggerated. If you're hit by a .50 BMG anywhere on your torso, you're not surviving. If you're hit in a limb, you're losing that limb entirely. The hydrostatic shock and massive tissue destruction are simply incompatible with life. German soldiers witnessed this happen to their comrades and adapted their tactics accordingly, learning to take out .50 caliber positions with snipers, indirect artillery fire, or direct tank fire rather than attempting infantry assaults, which wasn't exactly great news for the gunner's life expectancy. The M45 quad mount represented the most extreme example of American .50 caliber firepower for M2 machine guns mounted on an electrically powered turret that could traverse quickly in any direction and put out approximately 2,000 rounds per minute combined. That's roughly 40 rounds every second. The Quad 50 was originally designed for anti-aircraft defense against low-flying aircraft. But once the Luftwaffe faded away and the Allies achieved almost complete air superiority after the Normandy invasion, gunners turned them against ground targets. Instead, it earned nicknames like Meat Chopper and Kraut Mower. During the Battle of the Bulge, quad gunners would take out German snipers by simply cutting down the entire tree they were hiding in with sustained fire. The weapon didn't just kill it, disintegrated targets. For the men operating M2 South on tanks and other vehicles, life wasn't much safer than it was in the bombers. The M4 Sherman tank carried an M2 on a pintle mount behind the turret. But to use it, someone had to climb out through the commander's hatch and stand on the engine deck, completely exposed to enemy fire. The gun was mounted this way specifically so it could elevate high enough to engage low-flying aircraft. But that also meant there was absolutely no way to fire it from inside the armored vehicle. You had to be outside, standing up, visible to everyone. One tactical manual from the period noted that it was much cheaper to spray a suspicious bush with the .50 than to waste a main gun round on it. But doing so meant standing up where any German with a rifle could shoot you. The most famous M2 action of World War II happened on January 26, 1945, near Holzwihr, France. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy and his understrength company came under assault by roughly 200 German infantry supported by 6 tank destroyers. Murphy's unit was badly outnumbered and outgunned. He ordered his men to fall back to the tree line. Then he spotted a burning M10 tank destroyer that had been hit earlier. With its M2 still mounted on top, Murphy climbed onto the burning vehicle, fully aware that the flames could reach ammunition or fuel at any moment, and opened fire on the Germans advancing from 3 directions. For about an hour he stood there completely in the open, pouring fire into the attackers while the tank destroyer burned beneath him. He killed an entire squad trying to crawl up through a drainage ditch and inflicted an estimated 50 casualties overall. When someone later asked him why he did it, Murphy said simply, "They were killing my friends." He took a leg wound but kept firing until the ammunition ran out, then climbed down and led a counterattack that drove the Germans back. Murphy received the Medal of Honor and became the most decorated American soldier of World War II. But his story represents something darker than heroism. The fact that using the M2 effectively often required exposing yourself to almost certain death. The Korean War brought some of the most intense M2 use in history. particularly when gunners on M45 quad mounts faced Chinese human wave attacks. Veterans described it as cutting down massed infantry like a sickle going through wheat. The firing was so sustained during these engagements that barrels overheated beyond anything they were designed for, glowing red hot and actually beginning to sag from their own weight. Gunners had to pour water over them between waves just to keep shooting. The Quad 50's 4 guns were crucial because a single M2's rate of fire sometimes wasn't fast enough when thousands of Chinese soldiers were charging your position at once, blowing bugles and screaming wave after wave. This war also saw American gunners mounting telescopic sights on their M2 South for long-range precision fire, a technique that would reach its peak effectiveness in Vietnam. Vietnam gave M2 gunners 2 very different but equally deadly experiences, on the water and on the roads. The PBR patrol boat, river crews running interdiction patrols on the waterways of the Mekong Delta, faced combat at ranges so close you could see expressions on enemy faces. These fiberglass boats mounted twin M2 South and a forward turret and a single M2 at the stern. 4-man crews took these vessels through narrow jungle waterways where Viet Cong ambushes happened at 100 yards or less. The gunners had some armor shielding around their positions, but when the enemy opened up from concealed bunkers along the riverbank with machine guns and RPGs, there wasn't much protection besides speed and aggressive return fire. The casualty rate tells you everything you need to know. Approximately 6% of PBR crews were killed or wounded every month during the worst periods. Over a 1-year tour, roughly 3 out of 4 sailors could expect to be hit. The gunners manning those M2 South were returning fire in every single ambush. River Division 531 lost 7 of its 10 boats to rocket hits in just 40 days of operations. PBR sailors became the most decorated naval unit of the Vietnam War, with 2 Medals of Honor and 14 Navy Crosses awarded. And the gunners were in the thick of every action that earned those decorations. On the roads, Transportation Corps soldiers, mostly teenagers driving supply trucks, created something uniquely American after a devastating ambush on Route 19 near Pleiku, destroyed 30 trucks in 10 minutes. These 18 and 19-year-old drivers realized nobody else was going to protect them, so they started building their own armored gun trucks. By 1969, over 100 of these improvised fighting vehicles were operating across Vietnam, mounting M2.50 calibers, M60 machine guns, and even old M45 quad mounts scrounged from World War II surplus and welded onto truck beds reinforced with sandbags and scrap steel. Not a single gun truck was officially authorized by the Army, but the gunners who manned those weapons knew that every convoy could turn into a firefight, and they'd rather have unauthorized protection than authorized death. Vietnam also produced the longest confirmed sniper kill of its era, and it came from an M2 machine gun. Marine Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock, already a legendary sniper with 93 confirmed kills, set up on a hilltop during Operation Defiance with an M2 mounted on its tripod, fitted with a bracket that Navy Seabees had fabricated to hold an 8x unearthly telescopic sight. He zeroed the gun at 1,000 yards and started engaging targets out past 2,000. His most famous shot hit a Viet Cong fighter at approximately 2,500 yards, nearly a mile and a half away. The man was pushing a bicycle loaded with weapons and supplies down a trail. Hathcock later described it. "Here comes the hamburger," came right across the spot where it was zeroed. He bent over to brush his teeth, and I let it fly. If he hadn't stood up, it would have gone over his head, but it didn't. That record held for 35 years. It proved that the .50 BMG could do precision work at ranges where normal rifle cartridges simply couldn't reach. When Ronnie Barrett designed the first practical .50 caliber sniper rifle in 1982, Hathcock's work was direct inspiration. Barrett rifles have since been used to make 5 of the 20 longest confirmed kills in military history. But throughout Vietnam, the basic problem for .50 caliber gunners never changed. They had tremendous firepower, but that same firepower made them priority targets. And standardized gun shields for vehicle-mounted M2s weren't issued until far too late in the war. The next generation of gunners would learn this lesson all over again in the deserts of the Middle East. When American forces rolled into Iraq and Afghanistan, the Humvee became the standard vehicle for patrols and convoys, and the M2 gunner standing up through the roof hatch became the most exposed, most vulnerable person in every convoy. Early Humvees had thin aluminum bodies that couldn't stop rifle rounds. The doors were basically sheet metal. And worse, the gunners initially had no protective shields at all, just standing there in the open turret with their .50 caliber, while everyone who wanted to kill. Americans knew exactly where to aim. Insurgent tactics specifically targeted the gunner. Grenades thrown from rooftops into the open turret hatch. Snipers picking off the one visible figure standing above the vehicle. RPGs aimed directly at the turret ring. And IEDs, improvised explosive devices buried in roads, were catastrophic because the gunner caught the full blast of shrapnel that the vehicle's thin armor couldn't stop. Sergeant First Class Paul Ray Smith became the first Medal of Honor recipient of the Iraq War for what he did on April 4, 2003, near Baghdad International Airport. When his unit came under attack by a large Iraqi force and the crew of an M113 armored personnel carrier was hit and incapacitated, Smith climbed up and took over the vehicle's M2, standing completely in the open with no gun shields, while enemy fighters closed in from multiple directions. He kept firing, covering the evacuation of wounded Americans and stopping the Iraqis from overrunning an aid station where more than 100 soldiers had taken shelter. He was killed by a shot to the head while still on the gun, firing until the moment he died. Before deploying to Iraq, Smith had written his parents, "There are 2 ways to come home: stepping off the plane and being carried off the plane. It doesn't matter how I come home because I am prepared to give all that I am to ensure that all my boys make it home." Private First Class Ross McGinnis was 19 years old when he found himself in a Humvee turret in Adhamia, one of Baghdad's most dangerous neighborhoods. On December 4, 2006, an insurgent on a rooftop threw a grenade that dropped through the gunner's hatch and landed inside the vehicle right next to the other 4 soldiers. McGinnis shouted, "Grenade!" The standard procedure, what he'd been trained to do, was to yell the warning and then get himself out of the turret to safety. Instead, he threw his body onto the grenade. The blast that killed him left the other 4 men without a scratch. After nearly 100 years of exposed gunners dying in the open, the solution finally arrived. CR POW. C. The Common Remotely Operated Weapon Station. The Army rushed the first systems to Iraq in late 2004, and by 2013, over 8,000 were in service across all branches. CROWS mounts the M2 on top of an armored vehicle, just like before, but now the gunner operates it from inside using a joystick and a video screen. The system has day and night thermal cameras, a laser rangefinder, and computerized fire control that calculates ballistics automatically, hitting targets with over 95% accuracy even when moving. For the first time in over a century of service, M2 gunners could finally engage the enemy without exposing themselves to return fire. The same weapon John Moses Browning designed in 1918, almost completely unchanged in its basic operation, was now being aimed through cameras and fired with video game controllers. The most recent version, the M2A1, added a quick-change barrel system and a manual safety, but it's still fundamentally the same gun. About 100 countries use it today, and there's no retirement in sight. The 324th M2 ever produced was finally taken out of service in 2015, after 94 years of continuous use with the same serial number. The gun outlasted its operators by literal decades. It's still on battlefields right now, from Ukraine to the Middle East, still doing the job it was designed for over a century ago. But thanks to CROWS and similar remote weapon systems, the men and women behind it no longer have to stand exposed the way every generation before them did. From the frozen skies over Germany to the burning deserts of Iraq. It took 100 years to solve that problem. 100 years of gunners dying in the open so that a weapon could do its job. The M2 Browning is the most successful heavy machine gun in history. But that success was paid for in the blood of the men who operated it, standing in bomber turrets at 40 below zero, exposed on tank decks and open Humvee hatches, always visible, always vulnerable, always the first target. They called it Ma Deuce. The soldiers who used it had other names: the meat chopper, the widowmaker, the gun that never missed but never protected the man behind it. John Moses Browning created a masterpiece of engineering that will probably still be in service another 100 years from now, but he never had to stand behind one while people tried to kill him. The men who did paid the price for perfection.